passage of the Juvenile Restoration Act, a bipartisan effort that was supported by the conference that banned life sentences without parole for youth, and it allowed for new sentencing review opportunities. And that legislation aligned with several Supreme Court rulings which factored youth brain development into constitutional protections. Tonight's other panelists will be Ms. Krystal Williams, the Director of Government Relations, the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, Mr. James Dold, the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids, and last but not least, the Archbishop William Laurie, the Archbishop of Baltimore and the chair of the Maryland Catholic Conference. Now, before we proceed with our discussion tonight, I would like to invite the Reverend Marlon Tillman, the pastor of the Ames United Methodist Church in Bel Air and the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Work Group for Bridge, Maryland, to offer us an opening prayer. Pastor Tillman.
I knew that would happen. Thank you, Andre. Oh God, first and foremost, I want to thank you that last night's warm bed wasn't our cooling boards this morning, which means today, this moment in time, is an opportunity to honor and serve you with all sincerity for the most vulnerable population in Maryland, this country and around the world, and that is our children, your children. So we invite you, God, into our conversations tonight, that your wisdom shall prevail as we share our concerns, our aspirations, and our hopes for the consciousness of your people, to see the urgency to protect our children, your children, in times of law enforcement engagement. That our children, your children, will receive wise counsel, due process, and more importantly, care and not cages. You know, O God, that our children, your children, have immature and impulsive actions that can be attributed to mental illness, abandonment, and insecurities. And what they need is empathy first, and not the presumption of guilt and subsequent punishment. Search our hearts, O Lord. If there is any impurity in us, remove it, that your will may be done, a will that appeals to us to pray, seek your face, and turn from our wicked ways, so that your healing and redeeming power will prevail for all of your children, young and old. This we ask in your precious and loving name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Tillman, for praying for the protection of our children. And we look forward to you participating in tonight's very important discussion about our youth and be involved with the other panelists. Each will offer a brief opening statement to be followed by an opportunity for discussion and responses to pre-submitted questions. Audience members joining us via Facebook and YouTube can submit questions during the event by using the chat or email at communications@mdcatholic.org. Again, you could submit questions via the chat or send an email at communications@mdcatholic.org. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can during our allotted time. Now, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Senator Jill Carter, who represents the 41st District and is outspoken. She has long been an outspoken advocate for youth justice reform. Senator Carter has been a member of the Senate since 2018 and serves on a number of committees, including the Judicial Proceedings Committee. She's also a member of the Legislative Black Caucus and the Juvenile Justice Reform Council. Senator Carter, thank you for being us this evening. I now invite you to offer your opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody that's tuning in for this really important discussion. Archbishop Laurie and the Catholic Conference appreciate you highlighting this issue. It's very much appreciated. You know, it is true that this has been an issue that's near and dear to my heart for a very long time, and I'm so thankful to have so many great advocates with Reverend Tillman and Bridge, Maryland as well. I won't name every individual on the panel, but James Dole, he's been at this almost as long as I have, if not longer. And so basically it boils down to this simple. The state of Maryland has to stop violating the human rights of children. Let me repeat that. The state of Maryland has to stop violating the human rights of children. We have been rated at the bottom of all states in terms of how we treat children in our criminal justice system. And we have the tools, the knowledge, and the examples to fix the problem. For far too long, we've been having children be automatically charged as adults. The only area of the law that we treat children as not children is when it comes to the criminal justice system, where we discretionarily cherry pick some children to be automatically charged as adults based on the nature of the charges, and others we don't. This harms children and it harms society. We have a package of legislation that included the Youth Interrogation Bill. I recently spoke in a group of women, many of them mothers, and when I told them, do you understand that if your child is taken into custody by law enforcement, that not only is there no guarantee that you'll be notified, but your child won't even have counsel guaranteed at that custodial interrogation. And many of these mothers in the room were shocked to learn that this was the case, and certainly none of them found it acceptable. We have to change that. The Child Interrogation Protection Act is something we have to pass. And the package of reform legislation that we have before us this year is also long overdue, which puts a floor at the minimum age the child can be taken into the system and creates a lot of other mechanisms that, frankly, will help us grow young people into productive citizens that can flourish in our society, rather than unduly harm and punish them and handicap them from ever becoming people that are able to participate productively in society later. So thank you again for having me, and I'm happy to participate and answer your questions.
Thank you, Senator Carter, for your opening statements. Going into this new year, we see you haven't lost any passion for the young people of Maryland. Our second panelist this evening is Ms. Krystal Williams. Ms. Williams works on the front lines of youth justice in Maryland in her role as the Director of Government Relations for the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. Ms. Williams, thank you for being with us this evening, and now we'll hear your opening statement.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. So yes, I am with the Office of the Public Defender, and as many folks know, we take on an incredible role in terms of representing individuals throughout the state of Maryland in the criminal justice system that need representation. But one of the things that I really, that drew me to the Public Defender's Office here in Maryland is that we have a special division that really focuses on juveniles and youth in the system. And I started out my practice in the juvenile division in Baltimore City, representing juveniles throughout the agency, as well as children who are charged as adults. And what a lot of people don't understand, and a lot of clients that I came across and their parents and families, is that they didn't understand how the system worked and all the laws that we have on the books in Maryland that actually automatically place children into the adult system. So through our Government Relations Division, I am really excited to be working on this legislation that Senator Carter mentioned. There are three very important bills that we are working on as a #1 priority within our agency. And that is #1, the juvenile justice reform effort. That has been in the works for a couple of years now. We have an attorney who was working on the Juvenile Justice Reform Council and has put in a lot of really critical reforms in that particular legislation. There are 4 things that bill would actually do, which I think it's important to highlight. It would remove barriers to diversion. There needs to be expanded diversion to utilize an equitable requirement of informal adjustment of misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies for youth who have not been previously adjudicated delinquent. So it'll allow for more children to be diverted to alternative measures throughout community services. It'll also give prosecutors additional discretion to utilize those alternative measures rather than having to prosecute them through the juvenile court system. As Senator Carter mentioned, it would also raise the minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction. Right now in Maryland, we can charge children as young as 5 years old in the juvenile system. And a lot of people don't understand that either. And when you really think about that, prosecuting a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old in a court system where their feet may not even touch the floor of the, with the chair that they're sitting on, or the cuffs may not even fit the wrists when they're in a courtroom, or even understanding what is happening. Most of those cases are cases where children ultimately end up being found incompetent because they don't understand what is happening and they get dismissed. So it's really a matter of efficiency, but also fairness in terms of how we treat our children. So it would raise the minimum age to 13. It would also ban the incarceration of low-level offenses for children who are being prosecuted for minor infractions. It would make sure that they're not being incarcerated for those minor infractions. It would also put a ban on indefinite probation. In Maryland, many children are just placed on indefinite time periods for probation, and they don't understand what that means. They need certainty in terms of what is happening to them and goals that they can reach in a way that's developmentally appropriate for them. So that is a very important bill that will accomplish those four things. The other one that we mentioned is the ending of automatic charging of children in the adult system, which is critical, and then also protecting children's rights when they are being interrogated by officers. And so I know that we'll have an opportunity to talk more about those bills throughout the session, but I think it's important to highlight that yes, Maryland does need to do better when it comes to treating their children in the criminal justice system. And I look forward to getting those bills passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. You, as well as Senator Carter, are very concerned about children being charged and prosecuted in the adult system. Our next panelist is Delegate Sandy Bartlett, who represents the 32nd District and is an outspoken advocate for juvenile justice reform. Delegate Bartlett has been a member of the House of Delegates since 2019 and serves on a number of committees, including the Judiciary Committee and the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. She's also a member of the Legislative Black Caucus. Delegate Bartlett, thank you for being with us this evening, and we'll hear your opening statement as well.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to make my voice heard on behalf of all the individuals who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you to the Catholic Conference for hosting this event and having this event. And thank you to Senator Carter for being such an advocate, such a trumpeter of putting the message out there and doing it in such a steadfast manner. And sometimes when it wasn't the popular thing to do, but doing it anyway. And I really appreciate her for the example that she set and the road that she has paved. And I also thank James Dold. James is so humble. Sometimes I have to look up his biography to see all his accomplishments and all the work that he does. And thank you, James. I appreciate you for remaining in the fight, stay in the fight, and we will get it done. I spent a lot of time last session working with Krystal Williams and getting to know her and James and Reverend Tillman. I appreciate you all for, kind of lifting us up, us meaning the General Assembly. While we're doing the work in the General Assembly, we know that you're doing the work as an advocate and working with some of the people who will be directly affected by the decisions that we make. So thank you for that. I am delighted to be sponsoring again this year the Juvenile Interrogation Protection Act. And as we go along, I have an important announcement to make about that bill, which I will hold for in just a moment. But I'm super excited to be able to put this bill in again. It passed the House unanimously, and it did not pass out of the Senate, but I believe it's going to pass out of the Senate this year. And I believe that given the moments such as this town hall and the discussions such as what we're having tonight, and just the way it has been highlighted, I believe it will pass this year. I am confident and I am hopeful that it will pass this year. So I'm looking forward to the work that we've got ahead. Thanks, Andre.
Thank you, Delegate Bartlett. And you gave a shout out to our next panelist in your opening remarks. Our next panelist is none other than James Dole, the founder and CEO of Human Rights for Kids, a DC-based nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and protecting the human rights of children in the United States. Human Rights for Kids uses research and public education to coalition building and grassroots mobilization, as well as policy advocacy and strategic litigation to advance critical human rights on behalf of our kids. A central focus of Human Rights for Kids work is advocating in state legislatures and courts for comprehensive justice reform for children. Mr. Dole, thank you for being with us, and let's hear your opening remarks as well.
Well, first of all, Andre, thank you so much for moderating this panel discussion. And I also want to thank the Maryland Catholic Conference and my fellow panelists who have been doing really God's work in the trenches, whether it's fighting in the state legislature like Delegate Bartlett and Senator Carter, or on the front lines in the criminal legal system like Krystal Williams and her colleagues at the Office of Public Defender. I just thank all of you for the incredible work you guys do day in and day out. I'm going to keep my opening remarks a little bit brief. I also, Reverend Tillman as well, the organizing that's done through the faith communities is one of the central pillars of these sorts of campaigns that make them successful. So I don't want to forget the great Reverend Tillman as well. But, you know, in my remarks, I really want to kind of focus on two animating principles of our work. And the first being this notion of needing to protect the human rights of children who come into conflict with the law. In 1989, the United Nations approved the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which came 30 years after the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Within the CRC, there were specific protections that were outlined, which both Senator Carter and Krystal Williams did a great job of outlining. Several of them are going to be the subject of these bills that we've already heard so much about. But Articles 37, 38, 39, and 40 really focus in on what needs to happen when kids come into the criminal legal system, the due process protections that need to be in place, as well as how they should be treated, and prohibitions on certain types of cruel and inhumane treatment, such as the use of the death penalty and life without parole sentences for children, which Maryland had in place up until just last year. And so it's really important to contextualize this conversation around this broader discussion of the need to protect the human rights of our kids in the criminal legal system. And importantly, it's critical for folks to understand that the United States of America is the only country in the world that does this to our children. Every other nation in the world, you can pick up a globe, spin it, put your finger down. Every other country has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, except the United States. And it's why we see these vast human rights abuses, from interrogating children without the presence of legal counsel, without the assistance of legal counsel, to sentencing children to die in prison, transferring children into the adult criminal legal system where we sentence them and treat them by the same standards that we use for adults. All of these things are basic international human rights norms that have been embraced the world over, except here in the United States. And Maryland is one of the worst offenders. One of the things that we regularly say, as our report indicated in 2020, that the United States is engaged in one of the largest government-sanctioned human rights abuses against children in the world today. And that's point number one. The second point is that the children that we are talking about are some of the most vulnerable children in our communities. I oftentimes tell people that if you care about victims of sex abuse, if you care about victims of physical abuse, if you care about kids who've been neglected, if you care about kids who've experienced unimaginable trauma, you have to care about the kids in our criminal legal system, because that's where they end up when every other system fails them. It's no surprise that we see so many children who've experienced high rates of trauma. They act out as a result of that unmitigated adverse childhood experiences. They act out because of the trauma. They join gangs because they're trying to escape and find safety and in search of love and care and compassion, because we haven't wrapped our arms around them and given them that love and compassion and treatment that they need. And so as we engage in this conversation, it is critical for us to understand that the root cause of why we have kids who commit serious crimes in Maryland is because of the trauma that they've experienced. And so with that, I'm really looking forward to engaging more in this conversation and talking about the history of how we got here and what we need to do to make sure that we protect the human rights of every system-involved child. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Mr. Dole, for your very passionate statements about protecting our children. Everyone on this panel seems to have the same common goal to do what is possible to protect our children. Our next panelist is a man you all know, Archbishop William Laurie, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Baltimore. Born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1951, Archbishop Laurie has served as the 16th Archbishop of Baltimore since May 2012, going on 10 years. Archbishop Laurie has served on the U.S. Bishops Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism. In February of 2018, he released The Enduring Power of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Principles of Nonviolence, a pastoral reflection to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of the civil rights leader. In January of 2019, Archbishop Laurie released The Journey to Racial Justice, Repentance, Healing, and Action, acknowledging sins of racism within the church in the past and present and suggesting concrete measures to combat racism and promote racial justice. Archbishop Laurie, thank you for being with us tonight. And would you now please offer some opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Andre. Thank you for moderating tonight. And it's a pleasure to join with Senator Carter and Delegate Bartlett, with yourself, James, and Reverend Tillman, to really discuss an issue that is so important to everyone in the state of Maryland. And if I might, I'd like to offer a couple of reflections from the point of view of what we call Catholic social teaching, the cornerstone of which is the dignity of every person. And I think what we're striving to do here is to hold up the dignity of these young people and to ensure that that dignity is preserved and protected as they go through some very difficult times in their lives. I think the Church's social teaching would also hold, as other churches teach, that the criminal justice system ought to preserve and protect the common good of society. And what does this mean? Of course, we have to maintain public order, but we also have to restore the offender. So I think our efforts should be not at retribution, but restorative justice, especially when it comes to our young people. When you think about it, what does incarceration do except destroy the young person? What does incarceration do except disrupt their families and undermine the support system, postponing education, interrupting economic stability, and this in communities that are already struggling. Also like to hold up tonight the disproportionate impact of incarceration on low-income and minority persons. I don't think we recognize that nearly enough. Our system of justice is so often replete with economic and racial disparities. Maryland Catholic Conference, which I'm happy to represent, has long opposed policies that seek to address crime by building more prison walls. I think we should direct our resources elsewhere toward effective programs of crime prevention, rehabilitation, education, substance abuse, mental health treatment, and programs of probation and parole and reintegration. I'd also say that our church social teaching puts high value, the highest value, on those who are most vulnerable. And that is indeed our children and young people. And our system of justice should take care to ensure that there are safeguards for young offenders who have committed or who are alleged to have committed crimes under the age of 18. 2 points in particular. By repealing some of Maryland's stringent automatic charging measures where children are charged as adults, regardless of circumstances. And second, allowing cases where warranted to be resolved without an admission of guilt on the record, particularly when addressing an underlying social issue that would be more restorative and that we could really handle in another way, in a more restorative way and in a more productive way. Again, the Maryland Catholic Conference is very pleased to partner with Senator Carter and Delegate Bartlett and advocates that are at this meeting, this town hall meeting tonight, in addressing through legislation laws long overdue for reform so that we can turn around lives and not consign them to a life in a system that they have no real hope of escaping. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archbishop William Laurie. Now it is time for the panelists to respond to some pre-submitted questions. And we did, in fact, receive a number of questions in advance of tonight's town hall. And I'd like to begin by posing the first question to Senator Carter. All of our panelists are welcome to address, but the first one goes to Senator Carter. Senator Carter and Delegate Bartlett, can you provide an overview of the types of legislation we can expect to be introduced to bring about the much needed reform of Maryland's outdated juvenile justice laws, including the Omnibus Bill and the legislation aimed at ending Maryland's practice of automatically charging youth as adults, as you commented about earlier, as well as ensuring youth are represented by an attorney at interrogation?
Well, thank you for the question. Again, oops, sorry. Thank you for the question. I'll let Delegate Bartlett take some of it, and it's already been addressed, but I think it's important to kind of reiterate so people fully understand what we're talking about. The issue of the automatic charging children as adults, it's a pretty simple concept. Children are children. We don't let them contract. We don't let them do many, many things that adults can do because we say we recognize that they're children and they have a certain level of immaturity and don't fully always appreciate the consequences of their actions. And the only area of the law that we say, but in these 33 examples and instances where someone arbitrarily, discretionarily can decide that they're charged with something, whether they've done it or not, there's been no proceeding that determines whether they're guilty or innocent yet. They're simply charged. We say we're going to start them as adults and let them convince the court that they should somehow not be treated as an adult when common sense and fairness would dictate that we say that you're a child. And if there is an exception to why this person in this situation should be treated as something other than that, the state really ought to have the burden of proving that, of showing in this case, this child is not amenable to the treatment in the juvenile system. And there are reasons that the court can determine that we should treat them as adults. And so it's just heinously unfair. And I'll be brief about this, but I've had a lot of experience over the years as an attorney working with people in the criminal justice system. And overwhelmingly, I have found that where there are adults that have had a trauma that they cannot kind of overcome, and they continue in some fashion of dysfunction in life. It goes back to at some point when they were a child, they were arrested. And in Baltimore City in particular, there was a period when people would get arrested in mass for virtually nothing. Literally, there's a murder 2 blocks down, there's 8 people on the street. They were clean swept and held in jail for a time until it could be worked out. So children got caught up in that. And so they were held in the jail for months, deprived of their family, their education, mistreated in an adult system, only to have their cases ultimately adjudicated in such a way that they were either not guilty or they were ultimately waived back to the juvenile system. What did that do? Those months of sitting there in the adult system often has destroyed their psyche, their mentality, their motivation, their spirit. Oftentimes they were in solitary confinement or the equivalent, which was in some cases, in instances, it's the equivalent of torture. And so we need to absolutely change that. This is 2022. And so justice is long overdue for these children. You asked about the Omnibus Bill. Ms. Williams from the Public Defender's Office ran through it a little bit as well. But briefly, there's a Juvenile Justice Reform Council that's been working for 2 years. And we have recommendations, and those recommendations say that no longer should a 5-year-old be charged as if it was something that if it were an adult act, it would be a crime. No, they shouldn't be charged. We have services that can be provided to them in the system of social services that would not require them to be treated in a penal system as if it were a juvenile act equivalent to a criminal act for a young person. There's also the issue of keeping them out of prosecution where there are programs and services and diversionary opportunities for them so that they aren't stained and tainted with being in the system. In adult system, we call it diversion. In this arena, we call it informal adjustment. It expands the opportunity for a prosecutor to say, hey, you know what? In this instance, it is not prudent to put this person through the system. We're going to find a way to help them and give them the treatment and services they need without having to prosecute them. Also, parole and probation. We don't want young people to be violated and detained, incarcerated, the equivalent of incarceration to a juvenile facility for technical violations of probation. Easiest one to explain is failure to report. Something like that should not result in reincarceration or incarceration. And then finally, we also want to make sure that there are finite terms to probation, because children can't understand I'm on this long extended probation. They need to know that there's a window, there's an end in sight, there's a finite period of time that they have to be under the supervision of the court. And so we need to fix that. And those are some of the primary things. I could be leaving something out. And if I am, I'm sorry, but Delegate Bartlett is well equipped to take that up, as well as to talk about the Child Interrogation Protection Act.
Thank you, Senator Carter. And I am excited to talk about the Child Protection Act, and that is exactly what it is. I dropped that bill today, meaning that the bill will have a bill hearing in the House. We have 11 co-sponsors, so that means there are 11 other members of the House of Delegates who support the idea of the bill. I'll talk a little bit about the bill. It does 3 things specifically, and these are all reasonable things. Now, what's going to happen is, I'll tell you in advance, you're going to gasp that this is not already the law, because you would figure that it is, because it applies already to adults, but for some reason, it doesn't apply to children. As Archbishop Laurie said, our most vulnerable, but it doesn't apply to our most vulnerable, unfortunately. First, one thing that the law does is it says that parents are to be notified if a child is taken into custody. That's the gasping part, that it's not already in law. Can you imagine your child, your 5-year-old, your 6-year-old, any age under 18, being taken into custody for custodial interrogation or being asked questions by law enforcement that will affect the rest of their lives if answered in a way that they are not legally bound to do? Can you imagine as a parent, you have no idea that your child is in custody. You don't even know where your child is. So this bill states that the parent must be, that the law enforcement must make a reasonable effort to notify the parent. And that notice should include the child's location. It's not enough to say that your child has been arrested. We need to know where your child is. It also provides the reason why the child is in custody. Unfortunately, the last day of session 2 years ago, a parent notified me that her child was in custody. She found out because someone at the school told her. She didn't know where her child was. She didn't know where her child was taken. That is horrific. So as we talked about, I believe it was James Dole who mentioned the trauma that goes into effect when a person is arrested. Now we're talking entire family trauma. And so we have to preserve the family, and we have to preserve the rights of the child. Also, just let the parent know who they can talk to, and make it available for that parent to have conversation with the child. As Krystal mentioned, a 5-year-old, some children aren't even talking until they're 4. Some children aren't even clearly able to speak in sentences that someone else can understand until they're 5 or 6 or more. And so the inequity of all of this is absurd. We also want to make sure that Not only must law enforcement make the reasonable effort to notify the parent and all those things I just mentioned, but also that the child has and understands that they have the right to counsel. This is nothing new. This is already what the Constitution says. You're supposed to have a right to counsel. We're not coming up with brand new concepts here. We're just trying to make sure we enforce what is already in the Constitution. So there's counsel who must be notified, and the child has an opportunity to get advice from counsel. And then third, that Miranda rights, which we all know on this panel what the Miranda rights are, but that the child is given the opportunity to understand the Miranda rights in a way which they can comprehend. So for instance, already tonight, I've heard many terms being spoken that a child would not understand, even down to the basic term of when we started tonight when we said we were going to have opening statements. That is not something that is the normal language of a child. What is an opening statement, you may ask, right? As a child, a 5-year-old, do you know what an opening statement is? Of course you don't. Do you know what it means to waive, as in W-A-I-V-E? No, you've never heard that word being used in the context of waiving your rights. Some children, unfortunately, believe that waiving your rights is the W-A-V-E of waving your hand, and that is sufficient. And we learned that from testimony last year. So these are the 3 pillars of the bill. We've been working with the Office of the Public Defender's Office. We've been working with the advocates. And tonight, we also made an amendment to the bill to read and be called the Child Interrogation Protection Act. I know Senator Carter will be happy to hear that, because that is something that she has pushed for, and that was the original name of the bill. So we are back to the original name of the bill. Why? Because we want to protect our children and put our children first.
Wow, thank you very much, Delegate Bartlett and Senator Carter. And we here at TV 11 are looking forward to covering the Maryland General Assembly and the passage of the Child Protection Act. It sounds like it has a lot of support. I mean, did not know that parents were not compelled to be notified that their kids are in custody, where they're being held, and why. So looking forward to that. So thank you very much, Senator Carter and Delegate Bartlett, for those answers to that question. Mr. Dole, can you talk to us and give us a bit of perspective on the history of how Maryland has approached juvenile justice and the impact of the understanding of the development of the human brain?
Absolutely, Andre. And, I'll say that the history, for the most part, hasn't been that great, as my fellow panelists have alluded to. And, to get started, I really want to go back to something that Archbishop Laurie mentioned in his opening statements, which is this notion of racial disparities. And it's important to understand how we got to this point in Maryland, specifically when we're looking at the vast majority of kids being kids of color who are treated this way. And one of the things that we have to understand is that a necessary precondition to human rights atrocities is the dehumanization of the target population, right? So when we look throughout history, whether we're looking at the Holocaust, or we're looking at the genocide in Rwanda, whether we're looking at any sort of human rights atrocity you want to look at, slavery, the killing off of Native Americans, what always precedes that is a targeted campaign to dehumanize and otherize the target population. And so what happened to Black and brown children in Maryland in the 1980s and 90s was the same thing that happened to Black and brown children across the United States. In 1995, a group of criminologists had theorized that there was a new group of super predator children who were coming of age, who were more violent and more dangerous than ever before. These children were characterized as being godless, jobless, and fatherless monsters. And that if state legislatures did not act, they would be unable to stem the coming blood wave. And so you have to understand, when you start talking about children of color as godless monsters, they are no longer children. It becomes possible at that point to do unspeakable things to them. And so in 1989, as the rest of the world is embracing this human rights frame, the state of Maryland and the United States moves away from it through this targeted campaign aimed at children of color. The legislature adopted legislation making it easier to try children in the adult criminal legal system. Today, as Krystal alluded to, there are 33 offenses where children as young as 14 years old can be charged automatically as an adult. Maryland charges more children as adults in the criminal legal system every year than the states of California, Pennsylvania, and there's a bunch of others combined. What are the consequences of that? When children are tried as adults, they get adult sentences. They are treated the exact same way as adults. That means being sentenced to life imprisonment. So in addition to the super predator theory that was developed in the 90s and resulted in this easing of making it easier to try children in the adult system, Governor Glendening declared in 1995 that he would no longer approve parole for anyone serving a life sentence. This resulted in more than 400 people, 400 children here in the state of Maryland, essentially being sentenced to die in prison, to die by incarceration. To put that into perspective, when the United States Supreme Court decided Miller v. Alabama and decided that life without parole sentences were largely unconstitutional for youth, there was one state that was a huge outlier, and that was Pennsylvania, where they had sentenced more than 500 children to life without parole. Maryland, when we look at the policy of 1995 carrying over, was the second highest state. That's more than Louisiana, that's more than Alabama, that's more than any other state with the exception of Pennsylvania. And so for the vast majority of the history of Maryland, we have looked the other way when it comes to protecting the human rights of system-involved youth. We have looked the other way when it comes to protecting our children who are the most vulnerable in the criminal legal system. And for a state and for many legislators who profess that Black life matters, it's a tough pill to swallow if you're not willing to protect the basic human rights of your most vulnerable children, who also happen to be mostly Black and brown youth. And so I want to make sure that this is a central part of this conversation and understanding of both how we got here, why the policies have been so bad, and what we need to do and what we need to center in order to move away from these failed policies that have disproportionately harmed communities of color here in Maryland. I will say, to end on a more cheerful note, with the passage of the JRA, Maryland has now joined the vast majority of the country that have moved away from life without parole sentences for youth. And so that is a positive thing. So we are moving in a better direction. But for far too long, we have failed to protect the human rights of youth, and the legislation by both Delegate Bartlett and Senator Carter will move us even further along in that trajectory.
Mr. Dole, thank you very much. Thank you for ending on a positive note, because that was a rather austere picture painted on the history of juvenile justice in America, in Maryland and America. You talked about the legislation that Senator Carter and Delegate Bartlett were talking about. So this next question is from Ms. Williams. How do you think the legislation that the delegate and senator are talking about will positively influence the interactions that you have with the kids facing the current laws on the books?
Yes, thank you. So there will absolutely be a positive impact, amongst young people in Maryland that are, as we pointed out, a majority of the children that are in the criminal and juvenile justice system are impoverished or considered indigent. As a public defender's office, we represent individuals who are deemed to not have enough money to afford certain things, basic necessities in their life. And so when you're talking about children, by default, children automatically are at a point where they are reliant upon their parents in terms of their financial needs. but we also know that these children that we represent, not only are they living in a situation where they are not having their basic needs met, but we also know, and I know firsthand, that a majority of these children, as James pointed out, are suffering from trauma. These young people have been severely traumatized through their communities, through their schools, through their families. A lot of them are victims of crimes themselves. And when you look at children who are victimized and how they handle trauma, that is not dealt with appropriately, and they should not be criminalized for how they're reacting to their trauma. And many children, how they react to their trauma is through anger, through irritability, through behavioral problems that are deemed to be, in Maryland, delinquent behavior or criminal behavior, when really these are children that are just suffering from the loss of a loved one, a parent, a sibling, something that has traumatically impacted their life and disrupted their life, in addition to not being able to afford clothing or shoes or school supplies. And these absolutely impact these kids' self-esteem. Many of them are bullied. I have so many clients who have histories of being bullied themselves and who have lost loved ones. And we don't really acknowledge what that does to a child and how that may cause them to act out in certain ways. And so one of the biggest positive impacts is that we will stop criminalizing children for the trauma that they're suffering and how they react to that trauma. And so I also want to give a couple of examples of how these specific bills could impact cases that I've actually encountered in my practice. And one of them, goes to what Delegate Bartlett was speaking about, is how children simply just don't understand this process. I once represented a 7-year-old where it was the first time that I saw this young child coming in my practice and at that age. And I knew we prosecuted children that young in the state of Maryland, but actually visualizing and seeing that child and understanding that he was actually being prosecuted because he didn't properly articulate what happened. He had actually accidentally stepped on a neighbor's dog and their paw was broken. And when he went to go tell his mother what had happened, he said, I hurt the dog. And that was interpreted to, he intentionally hurt the dog. And it eventually was sorted out. But this is what we're prosecuting, and that has to change. So we will no longer be prosecuting cases like that. And another example is, when I represented children who are charged in the adult system, we have kids who have never been in trouble before, and they find themselves at 16, 17 years old being arrested and charged and prosecuted as an adult for something as common, unfortunately, that happens as a school fight. There was a fight at a basketball game. A kid punched a kid and the other kid passed out. That was then charged at first-degree assault. You have a young man who has good grades, never been in trouble before, and he is now subject to 15 to 25 years, as a charge on his adult record, being charged with a felony. He is subject to being booked in the adult system where he is strip searched and, housed in a place with, other individuals that he's never encountered before that have very violent backgrounds, potentially. It's a very frightening and traumatic experience. And those are the types of cases that we are prosecuting with the automatic charging of children in the adult system. That has to stop. One of the other impacts that it could have is, the Child Protection Act, the Child Interrogation Protection Act, is, as Delegate Bartlett also mentioned, a lot of these kids don't understand that they are waiving their rights to rights that we are all entitled to. Many adults don't even understand what Miranda rights mean and what it can do to protect the outcome of their case. But we know that up to 90% of children under the age of 18 waive their Miranda rights. That right there tells you that they don't understand what they're waiving. And I know firsthand, representing kids, that they've signed their waivers away, they've signed an initial papers, and they asked me, well, they didn't tell me what my Miranda rights were. And I'm like, well, I have a piece of paper right here that says that you initialed and that you signed, that you understood, but you're telling me that you did not actually understand what was being explained to you in that process. And one clear example of that, where you would expect individuals to understand this process, is I had a client whose father was his grandfather was a police officer, a retired police officer. and his grandchild was accused of committing an offense, and he felt confident enough in allowing that child to go to the police station and to be questioned. But what actually happened is he was fully interrogated. He ended up waiving his rights because he didn't understand what was happening. And this grandparent, as a police officer, he thought he was doing the right thing. But in the end, this child ended up waiving his rights to a crime where ultimately, he was not found to have been involved to the extent that he was being accused. And so these are the cases that we will be preventing from happening. We will have a very positive impact on the day-to-day cases that we encounter every day in Maryland that are simply unnecessary, and they're wasting resources, quite frankly, in the criminal justice system here in Maryland. And we have to do something about it in a way that's more effective, more efficient, and that's actually going to have an impact on real recidivism rates and real positive outcomes for these children and their lives and their families. So we absolutely need to take seriously protecting their rights and really upholding what we see true as valuing our children in this community.
Ms. Williams, thank you very much. And it's great to hear from your perspective that the legislation that Senator Carter and Delegate Bartlett are talking about will have a positive impact on the kids in the Maryland juvenile justice system. Thank you very much. Archbishop Laurie, how does the church's teaching on restorative justice compel the Roman Catholic Church to take a leadership role as regards the issue of juvenile justice?
Listening to the stories that Krystal just shared with us, who wouldn't be moved to try to take a lead and to do something about the kinds of injustices that go on? The church is not just, and it's true of all faith communities, we're not simply organizations that take public policy positions. We're actually involved in the flesh and blood lives of people. So we work with lots of young people, and we work with their families, and we believe in them. We believe in their goodness. We believe in their dignity. We believe that they should be given every possible chance. We want to do everything we can to knit bonds of love and affection and intimacy in families, because if you have any kind of a strong family unit, the chances of a child emerging into adulthood in a beautiful way is just a lot higher. The church's teaching on restorative justice is not something we just say, oh, state of Maryland, this is something you must do. I think like every other faith community that I know of, this teaching says to us, this is something we must do. And so that gets translated into social services of all kinds, whether it is case management, whether it's mental health services, drug rehabilitation, providing housing when and where that's possible, recognizing we can't do it all, but we can make a contribution. And also our schools are aimed not simply to be a private school system, but to be a place where we can educate as many young people as possible, show them love and care and compassion, and put them on a good path. So restorative justice is a teaching that we as believers first have to take to heart and put into practice. And then we can say to the state of Maryland, as we are now doing, well, that's something we should do across the board. And I would just say we're working hard at it, but we're a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Laurie. Reverend Marlon Tillman, you serve as the co-chair of Bridge Maryland, a faith-based community organization that fights for equality, social justice, and systemic change. Why are you and other members of the faith community so outspoken advocates for juvenile justice reform in Maryland.
I thought I'd figure out by now, Andre.
It's all good.
Anyway, let me put you like this. Edward Everett Hall has a quote I'd like to share. It says, "I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. What I can do, I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by God's grace, I will do." The faith community says it very clearly. We are called to this work because we're called to justice. Howard Thurman said that God is for the people of the oppressed, and our children are being oppressed by a system that says that they are not children, but yet being seen as adults. James put it very clearly that our children are being treated like adults when in fact they are just children who need to be cared for. They're in oppressed situations where they're making unconscious decisions and sometimes just simply poor decisions, and yet they're still being treated as being seen as someone who's guilty without actually seeing due process. And so we're in this work because of a couple of two things. One, and I want everyone to remember this, 23-1. 23-1. Whenever a child is placed in an adult system, they're giving 23 hours of isolation and 1 hour of freedom. After being part of this situation with COVID, just imagine that going on for more than a year or two, where you're being isolated for various reasons, and yet a child is being placed in this same situation. Likewise, what our children need is care, not cages. Our faith communities are saying very clearly to our legislators, of which we have two wonderful legislators who are with us tonight who already know this story, that it is our charge to you to make this difference. You can do it. We know you can do it. We know it's in your heart to do it. Do not be led by anything but your consciousness and what is necessary to make this happen. And I simply want to close with this. I cannot, with all that I have in my being, allow what's been going on to continue if I'm going to continue to look in the mirror and say that I've done my best for all of whom I love. I love my grandchildren, I love my children, I love all children, and so does God. And therefore, we need to be in that same avenue of our thinking as we deal with this type of legislation, that these are our children. We want the best for them in every situation that we can. And the best way to do that is to treat them as they are, children of God who love and can be loved, and more importantly, they can be redeemed.
Thank you, Reverend Tillman. That is a very important point. Children of God who can be redeemed. Thank you, and thank you all the panelists. We are taking part in a virtual town hall made up by lawmakers, lawyers, and members of the faith community. So we have just a bit exceeded the hour, but that's okay. We had a very passionate discussion, and thank you for all the panelists for your passion regarding juvenile justice reform in Maryland. It's a very important topic, and we look forward to working together to enact some change. And thank you for the Maryland Catholic Conference for hosting this virtual town hall. And now I would like to call on the Archbishop, Laurie, to close us in prayer, please.
Thanks again, Andre, and thanks again to everybody on the panel tonight. Let us bow our heads and pray. Good and gracious God, we thank you for this opportunity to be together and to talk about our young people and to talk about our obligations in your sight toward these young people. We ask you to continue pouring forth your Holy Spirit upon us, and to pour forth your Spirit upon our lawmakers, that in the legislative assembly that is unfolding, real progress will be made toward protecting our young people and their families. Real progress will be made toward enabling these young people whom you have created to lead a life that is commensurate with the dignity with which you have endowed them. Enable us all to work together in every segment of our community for the good of our young people. And this we ask in thy holy name. Amen.
And all God's people and their furry friends said, amen.
Yes, my dog has also chimed in tonight.
Great to hear that. Thank you very much, Archbishop Laurie. Thank you to everyone who participated and attended this virtual town hall put on by the Maryland Catholic Conference. You can see this town hall on the website of the Maryland Catholic Conference and previous town halls at the website mdcatholic.org. Thank you very much and good night.